Okay, now we're going. So thanks again for everyone for coming. My name is David Kaib. I'm one of the co-organizers of the Socialist Night School. We are tonight partnering with our friends in the NOVA chapter. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and we'll just jump right into it. As we go further, there will be time for questions, so hold on to those. You can also post them in the chat and we'll try and get back to them. If you have any questions about anything that's going on, feel free to put them in the chat. But I'm going to turn it over to our presenters and let them introduce themselves and take it away.
Great. Thank you, David, and thank you, Chip, as well. My name is Carlos. I am a member of the Northern Virginia branch and part of the campaign to repeal RighttoWork out of the Labor Working Group. And this is my roommate. Go ahead.
I'm Dan. I'm also helping out with the campaign to repeal RighttoWork here in Virginia.
We're both teachers in the Northern Virginia area who care about labor. And so we thought, we've been teaching virtually for the last 2 months. We thought it wouldn't be too difficult to just do a little bit about the history of RighttoWork in Virginia and in the South. So if you give me just a moment, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get started. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how this is going to go. I want to make sure that this is, how do I minimize this? Okay. So we're going to present directly. So we're going to talk about RighttoWork, but we're going to ground it in the historical and systemic contexts that it emerges out of, because it is part of the social and legal, in addition to the economic systems that have shaped this country and Virginia over the last 400 years or so. So part one is going to be pretty traditional. We're going to talk about the history of labor in Virginia going back, from slavery into Jim Crow, into RighttoWork now. Then we'll transition, we'll talk a little bit more about RighttoWork today and how that's affecting workers today. And we will then actually move into something a little less traditional. We're going to try a collaborative kind of interactive activity called the question focus technique. I've actually used this with my college students when they're trying to kind of solve big problems. And it's usually this process is meant to kind of use inquiry to help us kind of come to a better understanding of what we're talking about. So we're going to try that today. We'll use the breakout rooms feature that Zoom offers for that. So with that, I will turn it over to Dan. Looks like you'll have to click when you want to move.
That's fine.
Yeah, and Dan will take it away for the history part.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Dan. First of all, I'd like to thank you guys for the opportunity to speak tonight, and thank Carlos for putting this together and inviting me to speak tonight as well. I am a social studies teacher. Specifically, I teach U.S. history here in Northern Virginia. So I just hope to offer a little bit of background to you guys on a little bit of the history of slavery, Jim Crow, and how all this turned into RighttoWork here in the state of Virginia, especially.
Oh, you have to click, yeah.
Click, okay. So you see the origins of this all the way back to Virginia's slavery laws. We know slavery has been present here in Virginia since 1619, when the first ship brought people from Africa who were captured to the United States, to the Jamestown colony. And you can take many college classes just on the Middle Passage, just on slavery here in the United States. So I won't get into too much of that, but this is something that has been going on since 1619 in some way, shape, or form, and we'll see how this changes over the course of Virginia's histories. Obviously, when you read through the slave laws, you'll see very clearly, and that's what the second bullet point says right here, is that the laws were designed to protect the ruling class. Okay. Originally, there were two types of workers. There were in the colony of Virginia, there were your indentured servants, who were often white Europeans, and they were indentured servants were often farm workers But I have sources such as a school teacher who was contracted from Scotland to come over and work on a plantation in Virginia, but he was the school teacher for the local plantation, the white landowning plantation owners. So indentured servants were generally Europeans, whereas the slaves were from Africa. And that's where you see the real boundaries between Black people and white people here in the United States, especially among workers, being demarcated. There we go. All right. And then finally, as it says right here, 1705, you get the official slave laws here in the colony of Virginia that change slightly, but they really establish what slavery looks like here in Virginia. Now, the history of slavery in Virginia goes all the way up to 1865, and in the United States itself. Yes, the 13th Amendment does get rid of of slavery technically here in the United States, but notice that third bullet point with the 13th Amendment has a clause in it for people, basically people in prison, they can exploit their labor. And I'll come back into that in a second. But we know slavery was often used mainly, especially in the South, but slavery was present right up until the 19th century, and through the 19th century, often through the North as well. So through DC and Maryland had it all the way until 1865 as well. But slavery wasn't just confined to what's often portrayed in the media as just farm workers. There was also domestic workers as well. I like to highlight in Virginia the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, which was one of the largest ironworks here in the United States. Was a lot of the laborers, industrial laborers here in the South, were enslaved Black people. So that's just something to consider, that the enslaved people were forced to do many jobs, not just in addition to working on the plantations. So Civil War happens. Virginia rebelled against the United States over the issue of slavery, along with all the other 10 southern states are members of the Confederacy. They, as I like to tell my students, it's very clear they succeeded from the Union because of slavery. And you know, when people like to bring up that lost cause crap,
yeah,
sorry, I apologize for that. You can point to the acts of succession from every state, and it shows that, and they explicitly mention slavery. Well, the Civil War ends, and slavery is now unconstitutional. And what obviously the plantation owners did not like that. And so they passed what's known as the Black Codes across the South and across all the former slave owning states. They passed these Black Codes specifically to keep formerly enslaved people in what's de facto a state of slavery. It says in that second bullet point, designed to exclude Black workers from the economic system, forcing them to subsist on their own. There are all sorts of odd, arbitrary laws, such as formerly enslaved people could not leave the town of their residence or birth without special permission from like the local sheriff. And obviously the local sheriff did not want people moving around, designed to keep them trapped in those towns. And often the towns were just a few plantations and stuff like that. So designed really to keep Black workers in a state of slavery, or a de facto state of slavery. And then of course they looked at the 13th Amendment and said, oh, if we put Black people in prison, we can exploit them on like prison farms. One of the most famous ones being in Mississippi, the Parchman's Mississippi State Penitentiary, which is often just called the farm, which was basically a very large plantation where they forced mostly black convicts to work on the farm. Okay, so we do get, even in the labor movement here in the United States, You do get racism during the 1870s and 80s as America exploded with industrial growth. You do see in these early labor unions. Now, some labor unions were pretty egalitarian. The one that comes to mind is the Knights of Labor, but here we have the American Federation of Labor, originally headed by Samuel Gompers, I believe, was originally allowed their local affiliates. So like here in Virginia, they allowed their local affiliates to be segregated, okay? As you see here, railroad construction, the idea is that local affiliates could keep that segregation, keep separation between Black people and white people. And also the second bullet point, they advocated for the reauthorization of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act Americans passed because they saw the Chinese immigrants as cheap labor, taking American jobs and all that. So these arguments heard against us are arguments you hear today have been used for hundreds of years now. Now, education and labor here in the Jim Crow South. So the Black Codes didn't quite last as long because of Reconstruction. The federal government had to bring in federal troops to enforce Reconstruction. Unfortunately, in 1876, the incoming president, and I'm blanking on it, I believe it was Hayes.
Hayes or Harrison?
Yeah,
one of the Gilded Age.
Right after Grant, the 19th president, he struck a bargain with the Democratic-controlled South, basically saying, I will pull Reconstruction troops enforcing Reconstruction out of the South if you vote for me in Congress for president. And the South agreed to that. So the Republican president became president. The Republican nominee became president, but the Reconstruction troops pulled out, and the South across the entire former Confederacy, you see an institution of what's known as the Jim Crow laws, designed to maintain segregation. And these were upheld in one of the worst Supreme Court decisions, the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision, which established the principle of separate but equal. We know that is struck down in Brown versus Board of Education, where famously they said separate but equal is inherently unequal. But as you see, many times here across the South, they tried to fight, okay, in the courts. As it said, Plessy versus Ferguson went all the way to the Supreme Court. White juries, white justices, and the funding for segregation was often too much. But you see early organizations of African-American teachers, African-American laborers, farm laborers, industrial laborers across the South beginning to organize, okay? Oh. All right, now every story needs a villain. I know I've mentioned many villains, but let's give this villain a name, and this man's name is Vance Muse. He was a businessman in the oil industry, an oil industry lobbyist as well, and he was an organizer or lobbyist for all sorts of right-wing ideas. And it was, I believe, the American Christian Committee was the committee he founded, and he was editor of their newspaper as well. Vance Muse is our villain tonight. As you see the second bullet point right here, his own grandson described him as a white supremacist and anti-Semite, using the language, as we are very well aware, trying to use the term communist as a derogatory term to rile people's emotions. And this man really hated labor unions. And he used anti-Semitic, as you can see in that third point, anti-Semitic language against the labor unions. Committee, the CIO being the Committee of Industrial Organization here in America, now defunct labor organization, and said that these labor unions and this labor movement threatens the South. But at the same time, the Democratic Party in the South, despite being extremely racist, all for segregation, often Democratic politicians were all about ironically all about the little man too. Little man, they were all for helping you if you were white. And so to help push these right to work laws, Vance Muse being from Texas, he pushes these, comes up with these ideas of right to work laws. And we'll get into what right to work is in a second, but Vance Muse travels across the South, including here in Virginia, pushing these right to work laws. Vance Muse is quoted as saying, and I won't say the actual quote because it is extremely racist language, that he said, we basically, the idea of right to work laws as he sold it to Southerners was to keep Black people and white people separated so as they would not be able to organize together. And he sold that as when we come together as labor, he sold that to the Southerners as a problem, as racial mixing, and he said it's going to lead to all sorts of terrible problems. Now, also looking down at this bullet point right here, he also wanted to push for laws holding people on strike. So whenever they go on strike, it says financially responsible right there, legally responsible. So people on strike, a peaceful strike, he hated people going on strike. People on strike, peaceful strikes could get ticketed for inciting violence, even if the strike itself was peaceful. So the question comes to, what is right to work? And right to work here in Virginia means it doesn't ban labor unions, but what right to work says is, in that first bullet point, is that if you are not a member of a labor union, you can still enjoy the union negotiated contract, which on the surface, to someone not really thinking about it, sounds like, oh, so I don't have to pay union dues and I get the benefits. And a lot of people who didn't want to think more about it or didn't realize what this was doing just said, oh, that's fine. It's just it's a choice, joining unions is a choice. But what it really did is it cut union membership, because when you joined a job, you had to be a member of the union and you had to pay part of your paycheck in dues. Obviously, those dues were offset by the increase in wages due to the union negotiated contracts. But this really, really crippled the unions because membership dropped, because a lot of people said, I can't pay the X amount of money every week or month to the union dues, I need some money. We know across the South, they kept wages especially low for Black workers. And so many of them, seeing a way to save extra money because they were forced in such terrible financial positions, many of them left the union, and this cripples the union, reduces membership. Lots of unions fold and disappear. So right to work, while on the surface, when you explain basically you don't have to join a union if you don't want to, a lot of people go, oh, that sounds fine. But in reality, it's meant to cripple the unions and hurt the unions. Okay. Here in Virginia, where Carlos and I are right now, just to verify that, sorry. It's a point where the students are just laughing at me. Anyway, so here it goes to Virginia. Before we had Dominion Power, there's the Virginia VEPCO. We've got the full power monopoly here. Now we're currently still fighting. Dominion Power today is still one of the major leaders trying to maintain right to work. The labor union informed the governor that they wanted to strike. And the governor basically said, we're going to use the militia, turn out governmental sponsored violence against the strikers. This didn't happen. The strikers pulled back, but a lot of people were saying, oh my gosh, the power company and all that there was this wave. And Vance Muse sees the opportunity and pushes in, says, you can avoid this in the future with a simple right to work law. And notice right here, that last quote, that where a lot of Virginians, Virginian business owner, I don't want to say Virginians as in the people, but Virginian business owners and wealthy people said, this could be a real problem to our profits if we let people organize. And so they needed to stop the labor movement. All right.
And all right, thank you, Dan. I can take over from here. So, as I move my chair, I don't want to run over my cat. So that is a brief, and we could spend hours on this overview of the history of right to work in the South more broadly, and also in Virginia. And the point we want to arrive at here is that right to work is a Jim Crow law. It was a law that was intended to participate in one of the mechanisms of social, legal, and economic control of workers of color, and a way to divide workers along those kinds of lines in order to decrease their power. It was a direct response to the CIO and to some of those other radical organizing efforts, also to the Communist Party in Alabama. But we're going to move now into talking a little bit about the state of labor in Virginia today. So when I originally conceived of this idea of this night school, we had not yet had a pandemic to further highlight some of these issues. Last year, Oxfam rated Virginia as last in the nation for workers and worker protections. We were last in compensation, in rights, and in our rights to organize. And this is actually, so that is from 2019, but this, what you have on the screen in front of you now, I actually pulled like 3 hours ago from the Fairfax County COVID-19 dashboard. And so they do provide a caveat here at the bottom, and it is important to note that, about 20% of race and ethnicity data is missing from the dashboard data. But what we do see here is a gross disparity where Latinx workers account for about 17% of the population, but they are 65% of the COVID cases in Fairfax County. And that is just emblematic of all of the types of jobs that workers of color are more likely to have, because of obviously all these systemic and historical systems that we've been talking about, are the ones with less protections, right? And they're in that large 70% or so of people who cannot work from home, and who are going to their jobs and being exposed. And so we can see what kinds of damage right now, just in the last couple of months, right to work can wreak on workers, especially here in Virginia and here in Fairfax County. So I keep forgetting the button doesn't work. We tried. There was a great attempt earlier this year to repeal right to work. You may have heard about some of this. It was the House Bill 153, proposed by Delegate Lee Carter, DSA member, and only Democratic Socialist delegate in the House in Virginia. This would have been a full repeal of right to work. It had the full endorsement of the House Labor and Commerce Committee. But it was ultimately shot down, as you can see in some of these headlines I pasted into here, by the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. Now, those of you who may have been paying attention to the fight around Amazon, and the headquarters here in Northern Virginia may know kind of the Virginia Economic Development Partnership from their role in all of that. But they are not a group or an organization that is without blemish. There was a report in 2016 that was widely seen as damning of corruption within the VEDP. And so when this was in committee, this House Bill 153, the VEDP essentially surveyed some CEOs. The number is not exactly known. It was a small number. Most of them were not looking at development projects in Virginia in the first place. And obviously, unsurprisingly, these CEOs and corporate consultants said that right to work would cost the state corporate development, because unsurprisingly, bosses and managers don't like the idea of their workers organizing and what that does to profits. And so that just immediately killed it in committee, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean that we cannot continue to fight for the repeal of right to work and to restoring some rights to workers in Virginia. And so this is the point in time. Oh, we're running a little bit. We've got some. We're running a little bit ahead of time, which is good. This is the point in time where we're going to talk a little bit about together this problem that we're facing. And even if you don't live in Virginia, if you live in DC or in Maryland, obviously still want you to participate in this. This is a problem that we can all tackle together. And we're going to do this with a technique called the question formulation technique. I'm going to take a couple minutes to explain this, and then we will split you guys into groups in individual breakout rooms. And then you will follow those steps through in those breakout rooms, kind of working together. I want to mention that so you don't have to like participate in terms of in writing in any of this. We're going to ask, and it's suggested that moving through these steps, when I use this with my students in my classes, we move through these steps in writing. So students will, back before COVID, would write together on the whiteboard or maybe work in Google Doc. And we're going to attempt it with a Google Doc. I'm going to just copy put a link to the Google Doc in every single breakout room. You can do that if you want to. You can want to participate in that. We're not recording any of that information. We're just looking at that to kind of, it's a way of, it's more about the process rather than the end result or the end goal. And so this was actually originally used, I believe, in the Los Angeles Area Unified School District as a way to help parents of students with, I believe, IEPs better advocate for their students within the system. It also has educational uses as well. And so the rules here, and you guys will walk through these step by step, and the instructions that you guys will have in each breakout room will have recommended time and all of that. But the rules here are that you want to ask during this activity as many questions as you can. You don't want to stop to discuss, judge, or answer the question. You want to write down every question exactly as it is stated. If we're writing them down, you can just kind of fire them off verbally if you would prefer, and you can change any statements into a question. So the first step would be producing the question. Our question focus is repealing right to work in Virginia. And so here you're just kind of firing off questions. Ideally, one person would maybe type into the Google Doc while everyone else in the group are kind of just talking and stating questions. And once again, this is not any time to stop, judge, or analyze, just kind of move through it. The idea is just to get us talking about this issue. After that, and once again, we can kind of play loose with these rules here. Only engage with them as much as they help kind of prompt discussion. We can kind of mark questions as either open-ended or closed-ended. Closed-ended would be how many unions are there in Virginia right now, right? As opposed to what are different methods that have been used to increase union density, right? Where that's kind of a little bit more open-ended question where you can't answer it with a simple yes or no or a one-sentence answer. And then so once you have some questions generated, you can kind of talk about them, advantages or disadvantages to the different questions. And I have my students usually, rewrite one open-ended into a closed-ended and one closed-ended into an open-ended. You don't have to do that here if you don't want to, but that might be helpful. And then the next step of this is prioritizing questions. This is where we choose what kind of questions would provoke the most interesting ideas or methods, kind of like what piques your interest the most if our focus is moving forward in the fight against right to work in Virginia. And you could label them, if you're writing in the Google Doc, you can label them as 1, 2, and 3. Thinking about these bottom 2 questions here. And then the final step, and we will kind of give about a 1-2 minute warning to everybody once we're on step 3, that, hey, we're going to come back together for step 4 as an entire group. that'll be kind of more informal in terms of just people stating what they've learned from the process, and all of that, and that will kind of just like naturally lead into Q&A, and our final, like we have reading recommendations at the end as well. So that's what we're going to do. Let me hit escape here. Oh, we're already on the reading recommendations here. And let's split people into these breakout rooms. Let's see, give me one moment.
Breakout rooms are under more on the right bottom. And if you want, I can handle it if you can't find it.
That might be helpful.
Yeah, that actually might be helpful.
Okay.
Yes.
Here's the
I
question.
think only the host has more, not
Ah, yes.
like,
Okay. So how many, so we have 23 people. How many people do you want it? How many groups?
Let's do like 4 or 5 in each room.
Okay.
So like maybe about four breakout rooms would be good.
Should we go off the live stream before we do the breakout groups?
So we can do that, but the breakout groups will not be streamed.
Okay.
Yep.
Do we know that for a fact, or?
I know that for a fact.
Okay, that's fine then. Yes, I didn't know that. I did not know that.
It's a good question. All right, folks. So
we're gonna have like random breakout groups live streaming.
All right. So we're going to put you in your breakout groups, and you'll have to accept them. So please do, so we can do this activity. And we can also type in messages to everyone if we want.